everyone, Miss Leach here. Hope you're all managing to keep busy in your time at home. So I thought I'd do some novel time, and for this I've chosen The Burrowers by Mary Norton. It's one of my favourites. It's an English classic, so it was first published in 1955, 65 years ago. It's packed full of adventure and mystery and intriguing characters, so I'm sure you're going to love it. I plan to read a chapter every school day, so Monday through to Friday. So I'll start by reading the publisher's description, which you can see. So it says, deep beneath the floorboards lives the tiny borrower family, Pod, Homily and Arietti Clock. Everything they have is borrowed from the humans above them. Even their names are not quite their own. There is just one rule. They must never be seen. Then one day, Arietti meets the boy, and the family's incredible adventure begins. So there's the front cover. Okay, so The Borrowers, Chapter 1. It was Mrs. May who first told me about them. No, not me. How could it have been me? A wild, untidy girl. Self-willed little girl who stared with angry eyes and who was said to crunch her teeth. Kate, she should have been called. Yes, that was it. Kate. Not that the name matters much either way. She barely comes into the story. Mrs. May lived in 2 rooms in Kate's parents' house in London. She was, I think, some kind of relation. Her bedroom was on the first floor, and her sitting room was a room which, as part of the house, was now called the breakfast room. Now breakfast rooms are all right in the morning when the sun streams in on the toast and the marmalade, but by afternoon they seem to vanish a little, and to fill with a strange silvery light, their own twilight. There is a kind of sadness in them then. But as a child, it was sadness Kate liked. She would creep into Mrs. May just before tea time, and Mrs. May would teach her to crochet. Mrs. May was old, her joints were stiff, and she was, not strict exactly, but she had that inner certainty which does instead. Kate was never wild with Mrs. May, nor untidy, nor self-willed, and Mrs. May taught her many things beside crochet, how to wind wool into an egg-shaped ball, how to run and fell and play a darn, how to tidy a drawer and to lay like a blessing above the contents, a sheet of rustling tissue against the dust. Where's your work, child? Asked Mrs. May one day, when Kate sat hunched and silent upon the hassock. You mustn't sit there dreaming. Have you lost your tongue? No, said Kate, pulling at her shoe button. I've lost the crochet hook. They were making a bed quilt in woolen squares. There were 30 still to do. I know where I put it, she went on hastily. I put it on the bottom shelf of the bookcase just beside my bed. On the bottom shelf, repeated Mrs. May, her own needle flicking steadily in the firelight. Near the floor? Yes, said Kate, but I looked on the floor, under the rug, everywhere. The wool was still there, though, just where I'd left it. Oh dear, exclaimed Mrs. May lightly. Don't say they're in this house too. That what are? asked Kate. The borrowers, said Mrs. May, and in the half-light she seemed to smile. Kate stared a little fearfully. Are there such things? She asked for a moment. As what? Kate blinked her eyelids. As people. Other people. Living in a house. Who borrow things. Mrs. May laid down her work. What do you think? She asked. Kate looked away. I don't know, she said, pulling hard at her shoe button. There can't be. And yet... She raised her head. And yet sometimes I think there must be. Why do you think there must be? Asked Mrs. May. Because of all the things that disappear. Safety pins, for instance. Factories go on making safety pins, and every day people go on buying safety pins, and yet somehow there never is a safety pin, just when you want one. Where are they all? Now, at the minute, where did they go to? Take needles, she went on. All the needles my mother ever bought. There must be hundreds. Can't just be lying around this house. Not lying about the house, no, agreed Mrs. May. And all the other things we keep on buying, again and again and again, like pencils and matchboxes and sealing wax and hair slides and drawing pins and thimbles. And hat pins, put in Mrs. May, and blotting paper. Yes, blotting paper, agreed Mrs. Kate. But not hat pins. That's where you're wrong, said Mrs. May, and she picked up her work again. There was a reason for hat pins. Kate stared. A reason? She repeated. I mean, what kind of reason? Well, there were 2 reasons, really. A hat pin is a very useful weapon, and, Mrs. May laughed suddenly, But it all sounds such nonsense, and she hesitated. It was so very long ago. But tell me, said Kate, tell me how you know about the hat pin. Did you ever see one? Mrs. May threw her a startled glance. Well, yes, she began. Not a hat pin, exclaimed Kate impatiently. Whatever you call them, a borrower. Mrs. May drew a sharp breath. No, she said quickly, I never saw one. But someone else saw one, cried Kate, and you know about it. I can see you do. Hush, said Mrs. May. No need to shout. She gazed downwards at the upturned face, and then she smiled, and her eyes slid away into the distance. I had a brother, she began uncertainly. Kate knelt upon the hassock. And he saw them. I don't know, said Mrs. May, shaking her head. I just don't know. She smoothed out her work upon her knee. He was such a tease. He told us so many things, my sister and me, impossible things. He was killed, she added gently, many years ago now, on the northwest frontier. He became colonel of his regiment. He died what they call a hero's death. Was he your only brother? Yes, and he was our little brother. I think that was why. She thought for a moment, still smiling to herself. Yes, why he told us such impossible stories, such strange imaginings. He was jealous, I think, because we were older, and because we could read better, and he wanted to impress us. He wanted, perhaps, to shock us, and yet... She looked into the fire. There was something about him. Perhaps because we were brought up in India amongst mystery and magic and legend, something that made us think that he saw things that other people could not see. Sometimes we'd know he was teasing, but at other times, well,